Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. There's a fair bit going on, so let's get stuck into it. The first thing is there's been another assassination attempt on US President Donald Trump. And is anyone really surprised as the US becomes a place of increasing violence and where you have a president and a secretary of war, I'll emphasize of war, who seem to rejoice in killing and destruction and mayhem? Not that I'm suggesting a causal link between the two, but for me it just shows how far from Australia and Australian values the United States is becoming. Sticking with the US for a moment, the Navy Secretary John Phelan has been abruptly fired, apparently because he was unable to deliver Trump's battleships, the proposed Trump-class battleships, these useless monsters of 40,000 tons. That project is going nowhere, so Phelan has gone. Our Defence Minister Richard Marles has, of course, brushed off any concerns, as always, saying nothing is going to have an impact on AUKUS. I'll come back to that in a moment. And I'll remind everyone, Trump and the Secretary of War have now fired 34 senior defence uniformed and civilian people, including 6 out of 8, 6 out of 8 members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The military is being purged, with competent people being replaced by Trump loyalists. I think it's a scary development, and the consequences of this are going to be felt for years to come. Now, locally, there have been a couple of important announcements, including a big contract with Thales for a further 270 Bushmaster Protected Mobility Vehicles, with some of those to be sold to the Netherlands. Bushmaster has been a success story, and I have no problem with further orders, though personally I would have preferred to see fewer Bushmasters and an increased order for tracked, much more powerful Redback infantry fighting vehicles being built by Hanwha at a site near Avalon Airport. On top of that, there's the news that we will buy $2.3 billion worth of PrSM missiles. That's short for precision strike missiles. They are the longer range munition fired from HIMAR's multiple launch rocket systems that have a range of up to 1,000 kilometers and can be maneuvered during flight onto their target so they can be used, for example, against moving ships at sea. This is an excellent capability, but I have my doubts about the timescale and the ability of the US to deliver, because you might like to know that Estonian Defence Minister, Estonia, the land of my ancestors, Hanno Pevkur, says the US, in the form of the aforementioned Pete Hegseth, have told him personally that weapons deliveries have been paused because of the situation in the Middle East, and he has not been told when they will resume. And the weapons that he refers to are guided rockets for Estonia's HIMARS systems and Javelin anti-tank weapons. If it can happen to Estonia, it can and is happening to all NATO members. It could also be happening in Australia, but we won't know because our government simply will not tell us any information that would negatively reflect on the US, and the reliability of the alliance will be ruthlessly suppressed to minimize criticism of the situation. Now, we were always going to get PrSM. We have been paying for its co-development, around about $400 million to date, I think, on offer for a land-based anti-ship requirement as a competitor to PrSM was a system codenamed Strikemaster. I've referred to it before, which was basically 2 Naval Strike Missiles from Kongsberg mounted on a Bushmaster chassis. Very importantly, a solution developed in Australia. As I mentioned, Kongsberg is building a factory for the production of the Naval Strike Missile and its air-launched parent, the Joint Strike Missile, at a factory near Newcastle Airport. I would have preferred that they were awarded this particular contract, part of what is known as Land 8117, because at least we know that NSM can and will be built in Australia. To be fair, there is talk of also manufacturing PrSM here at some future point, but things with the US go very slowly, and as we are observing, can swerve in unexpected directions at the drop of a hat. On that theme, latest opinion polling shows that about 2/3 of Australians disapprove of Trump. Yet our politicians, led by the groveller-in-chief, Defence Minister Richard Marles, followed closely by the Prime Minister, insist on slobbering all over US boots. I have been predicting for a while that whichever moves first between Labor and the coalition to start putting a sensible amount of distance between ourselves and the US will see an increase in their popularity because they will be tapping into the popular mood. And as for the likes of the Mike Pizzulos of the world yelling about Mark 48 torpedoes and resupply and all of that sort of stuff, no, I'm not talking about breaking off relations with the US and throwing all of their equipment into the sea. We are better off not antagonizing Trump, and we will still need things like F-35s for quite a while. That's, until the mid-2030s when we can replace them with South Korea's KF-21 twin-jet stealth aircraft. In the context of AUKUS, I noticed that the US has awarded in Australian dollars about $270 million worth of work to Electric Boat to support engineering services work, whatever that is. Now, that's Australian money being recycled. Our donation of so far about 3 billion Australian dollars goes to an account administered by the US Secretary of the Navy, the just sacked John Phelan. I don't think Australia has any visibility at all about what happens with that money. Anyway, we had to find out about this 275 billion, not from our people, as always, but we found out from US Congressman Joe Courtney. And I think now would be a good time to have an actual, decent, proper, independent inquiry into AUKUS, led by a knowledgeable person acceptable to both sides of politics and not someone who's part of the national security apparatus that got us into this mess in the first place. Somebody like a retired judge might fit the bill. And something that the government doesn't seem to understand, you can review a project without work on it stopping. People at the Australian Submarine Agency can keep on beavering away, doing whatever it is that they do, Monday to Friday, and you can have a review team coming in and running the ruler in detail over all of these activities. It might be a minor inconvenience, but that's no reason for a proper independent inquiry taking place. And I think it's also worth asking the question, along with whether these things are going to be delivered, how much money it's costing, it's worth asking the question, are nuclear-powered submarines the best technology, or are alternatives taking over? Because nuclear reactor technology is sort of at the end of its evolution. As I've tried to explain before, nuclear reactors are not particularly complicated bits of machinery. They have to be built to extremely high standards, particularly for naval reactors, but you're basically talking about an 18th century steam engine where uranium-235, in the case of our future submarines, are the heat source, taking over from coal as being the heat source in the 18th, 19th, and a fair bit of the 20th century. Well, heat source still continues for lots of commercial nuclear reactors. So that's not going to evolve any further. However, battery technology, on the other hand, is really on the up and up, with hundreds of billions of dollars around the world going into these systems, driven by electric vehicles, the move to electric vehicles and to home and business battery storage systems. Inevitably, there will be constant improvements to battery performance and the occasional sort of major breakthrough. Currently, see what I did there? Current, electricity. A conventional submarine equipped with lithium-ion batteries and or independent propulsion systems can stay underwater for about 20 days, admittedly travelling quite slowly. But imagine in a few years from now, when non-nuclear submarines, benefiting from continuous improvements to battery technology, can operate underwater for 30 or even 40 days, and when their top speed, submerged, doubles or triples. You don't need much imagination with constant developments in battery technology to see how conventional submarines will soon be offering performance similar to that of a nuclear-powered submarine at a fraction of the cost. And Australia might end up with Virginia-class submarines simply because the US no longer wants theirs. And this is even before we get into uncrewed underwater systems that I keep on referencing that I believe are the future of warfare, as Ukraine is demonstrating every day. With the alliance, even the British are waking up. Even the British. I received an email on April 24th, which doesn't seem to, the contents don't seem to have received any coverage that I've seen in the mainstream media. The headline was, "The UK must adjust to the new reality of its relationship with the US, says Lords Committee." And I'll read from this. I'm sorry, this is going to take a minute or so because there's a fair bit of substance. Today, the House of Lords International Relations and Defence Committee has published its report, Adjusting to New Realities, Rebalancing the UK-US Partnership. The report concludes that the UK must reframe its relationship with the US and dismiss previous sentimentality about a special relationship, in inverted quotes, special relationship. While the US remains a close ally, its strategic and political priorities mean that future relations with the UK will be far more transactional and interest-based. The UK must therefore rebalance its approach to the US, collaborate where it can, but also hedge where it must, in recognition of a partnership remains vital but less predictable. This will include working with partners and strengthening the UK's capacity to act without US support where feasible. Ultimately, a UK that is stronger, more strategically autonomous and resilient will be the surest foundation for a more balanced transatlantic partnership, one that consistently advances and protects the UK's national interest. Now, I'll interrupt myself there by saying that you could substitute the UK for Australia, and these words would make perfect sense to me. Anyway, the House of Lords report continues. While the second Trump administration has shone a light on the challenges in the relationship, the report notes 5 core trends in US politics that will impact the relationship in future, irrespective of who sits in the Oval Office. This is really important, irrespective of who sits in the Oval Office. These include China's rise as a geopolitical competitor, related calls for Europe to take more responsibility for its defence and security, a resentment of globalisation and its impact on ordinary Americans, a recourse to economic nationalism and a willingness to deploy protectionist tools such as tariffs, a polarised domestic climate that will lead to pendulum swings between administrations with very different political dispositions, thus raising questions over consistency of US policy. As a result, the UK must be hard-headed and realistic about the future trajectory of the relationship. Here, the House of Lords has got it absolutely right, and I just wish that more people in Australia, particularly our politicians who insist that nothing has changed, would go ahead and read that report. Even Europe is growing a collective spine and under a new plan will invest 800 billion euro in defence production between now and 2030. That's a staggering 1.3 trillion Australian dollars. Now, whether European defence industry, which now includes Ukraine, can rise to the challenge is yet to be seen, but I tell you what, they will give it a go, and money is no longer an objective. A piece of trivia, I don't want to say it, but I'm lightening the mood because this is nothing funny or amusing about this, but I noticed that during Israel's bombing campaign of Iran, the Israeli Air Force completely destroyed the Jewish synagogue in the middle of Tehran, fortunately without loss of life. I wonder what that is about. The Israeli Air Force said vaguely it was collateral damage, but no, it wasn't. It was a direct hit from a very large munition. Anyway, it turns out that Iran's small Jewish community, they've been there for a couple of thousand of years, isn't a great fan of the destruction being done to Iran by the combined US and Israeli bombing campaigns, which I note has been suspended for the moment, who knows for how much longer. And I've noticed that some Australian commentators are up to their old tricks of saying that anyone against US and Israel bombing Iran back to the Stone Age is supporting the brutal Iranian theocratic regime. So let me make it clear, I am doing no such thing. I'm merely pointing out, as I've done consistently, that rather than getting rid of a loathsome regime, the actions of the US and Israel might well be strengthening it. I assume our PM is regretting his early enthusiastic endorsement of the attacks on Iran, though the other night I saw him backsliding when being interviewed by Sarah Ferguson, asked if he understood why the Australian people might be concerned about President Trump saying he wasn't happy with Australia for our lack of support for military being used to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. He could only say words to the effect, well, that was a matter for the US president. No, the question was about the reaction, his reaction of the Australian people to criticisms of the US president. Here's my suggested response for the Prime Minister. If he were to say, not for the first time, the words of the US president should not be taken literally. The people of Australia are entitled to feel concerned because he doesn't know what he's talking about. I share that concern. And just a reminder, if anyone needs it, that Donald Trump's decision to do Benjamin Netanyahu's bidding and go to war with Iran and the subsequent closure of the Strait of Hormuz is all his doing. It's all his responsibility, and the oil and gas and fertilizer products flowing through the Strait of Hormuz, 80% of that goes to this region, including Australia. And I can assure people that countries like Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and sort of us, though we won't see it, know it is entirely the doing of the current Trump administration. Now, what else? I also noticed some favourable reporting of some statements made by Admiral Sam Paparo, the head of the largest US command, Indo-PACOM, concerning AUKUS. He said that it's all about deterring China. He also had a swipe at Russia, saying that Russia is active in the region, something that I remind people of. He's enthusiastic about the 2027 rotational deployment of Virginia-class submarines. He didn't actually mention anything about AUKUS Pillar 1 in his speech, but he, in answer to questions from congressmen, had some nice things to say about it. But given my interest in understanding how the other side thinks in all of this, what do you imagine the consequences are in China of President Trump and Secretary of War trying to lift US defence expenditure by 50%? Not Australia's claimed fraction of a percent of our budget, but an unprecedented 50% increase from an already bloated $1 trillion to a breathtaking $1.5 trillion. That is surely one of the greatest percentage increases in military spending by any country ever. It's unprecedented and seems to have received not much coverage here, maybe to be fair, because it's unclear how much of it will survive Congress. But if I were in Beijing, the alarm bells would be ringing, and I would be looking at ways of increasing my defence spending. And that's leaving out of all of this the signal of the frat boy Pete Hegseth calling himself the Secretary of War. I was hoping to say something about Megami frigates. I'm out of time. I'll do that next time. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia-Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.